The morning mist clung to the jagged peaks of the Sierra Madre Oriental like ghostly fingers, concealing what would soon become one of the most decisive battlefields in North American history. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna stood atop the rocky heights of Cerro Gordo, his weathered hands gripping the brass telescope that had witnessed countless battles across Mexico's turbulent landscape. Below him, stretched across the narrow mountain pass, lay his carefully constructed fortress, a maze of earthworks, cannon emplacements, and defensive positions that he believed would crush the advancing American army once and for all. It was April 17, 1847, and Santa Anna's confidence bordered on arrogance. The Mexican general had chosen his position with the calculated precision of a chess master. The steep terrain of Cerro Gordo rose nearly 800 feet above the surrounding valley, its rocky slopes seemingly impregnable to any conventional assault. The main road from Veracruz to Mexico City, the very lifeline of American General Winfield Scott's campaign, wound directly through this mountain bottleneck, exactly where Santa Anna wanted it. "Let them come," Santa Anna murmured to his aide-de-camp, Colonel José María Tornel, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen empires rise and fall. "These Americanos think they can march through Mexico as if it were their own backyard. They will learn that Mexican soil drinks the blood of invaders." The Mexican force numbered approximately 12,000 men, a formidable army by any standard. Santa Anna had positioned his troops with meticulous care. Artillery batteries commanded the main road, infantry divisions occupied the high ground, and cavalry units waited in reserve to exploit any breakthrough. The general's plan was brutally simple: allow the Americans to advance into the killing zone, then unleash a devastating crossfire that would shatter their columns and send the survivors fleeing back to the coast. According to historical accounts, documented in the New York Herald's dispatches from the Mexican-American War, Santa Anna's defensive preparations at Cerro Gordo represented some of the most sophisticated military engineering of the conflict. The Mexican commander had learned from his previous encounters with American forces, particularly the painful lessons of the Texas Revolution and the early battles of the current war. This time, he would not underestimate his enemy's capabilities, but neither would he surrender the tremendous advantages that the mountainous terrain provided. As dawn broke over the Sierra Madre, the sound of distant drums echoed through the valleys below. The American army was approaching, and Santa Anna felt the familiar surge of anticipation that preceded battle. He had positioned his forces to control every possible avenue of attack, or so he believed. The narrow mountain passes, the steep slopes, the carefully placed artillery, everything conspired to make Cerro Gordo an impregnable fortress. But hidden in the morning shadows, American scouts were already moving through the seemingly impassable terrain, their eyes sharp and their movements silent. Among them was a young engineer officer, whose reconnaissance would soon reveal the fatal flaw in Santa Anna's seemingly perfect defensive plan. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of two armies, but the future of an entire continent. The Battle of Cerro Gordo was about to begin, and neither side could fully comprehend the magnitude of what was about to unfold in these ancient mountains. General Winfield Scott dismounted from his bay stallion with the measured grace of a man who had spent 4 decades in military service. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, with silver hair that caught the morning light and a uniform that bore the weathered dignity of countless campaigns, Scott commanded respect through presence alone. His piercing blue eyes surveyed the forbidding landscape ahead, and even his legendary confidence seemed momentarily shaken by the challenge that lay before his army. The American force that had marched inland from Veracruz numbered approximately 8,500 men, a smaller army than Santa Anna's, but one hardened by the successful siege of Mexico's premier fortress city. Scott's soldiers represented the cream of the United States military. Regular infantry regiments with names that would echo through American military history, artillery batteries that had proven their worth in the bombardment of Veracruz, and volunteer units filled with men who had left their farms and workshops to serve their expanding nation. "Gentlemen," Scott addressed his assembled officers, his voice carrying the authority of command across the rocky ground where they had gathered for their war council. "We face a situation that would challenge Alexander himself. Santa Anna has chosen his ground well, perhaps too well for his own good." The main road ahead disappeared into what appeared to be a death trap. The narrow defile between the mountains offered no room for maneuver, no opportunity for the kind of flanking movements that had characterized successful American tactics throughout the war. A frontal assault up those steep slopes would be nothing short of suicide, sending waves of blue-uniformed soldiers into the teeth of positioned artillery and entrenched infantry. Captain Robert Edward Lee, the young engineer officer who had distinguished himself during the Veracruz campaign, stepped forward with a crisp salute. His dark eyes held the intensity of a man who had spent the previous night crawling through brush and scrambling over rocks that would have challenged a mountain goat. "General Scott, sir, I believe I may have discovered something of considerable interest." Lee's reconnaissance had been both exhaustive and dangerous. While Santa Anna's attention remained fixed on the obvious approaches along the main road, the methodical engineer had explored every ravine, every ridge, and every seemingly impassable slope in the surrounding area. His findings would prove to be the key that unlocked Santa Anna's fortress. "There is a path," Lee continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. "It's barely wide enough for men in single file, and in places it's more of a goat track than a proper route, but it leads around the left flank of the Mexican position. If we could move a substantial force along this route without detection, we might be able to strike the enemy where they least expect it." The assembled officers exchanged glances that mixed skepticism with hope. Brigadier General David Emanuel Twiggs, a veteran of the War of 1812 whose weathered face bore the scars of frontier combat, leaned forward with interest. "How substantial a force could this path accommodate, Captain?" "A full division, sir. Possibly more if we're willing to accept the time required for such a movement. The path is treacherous, but it's passable for infantry. Artillery would be extremely difficult but not impossible for the lighter pieces." Scott's strategic mind was already working through the possibilities. A flanking movement of this magnitude would require perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and a level of coordination that would test every aspect of his army's capabilities. But the alternative, a frontal assault against prepared positions, offered little prospect of success and the virtual certainty of catastrophic casualties. The general's decision would determine not just the outcome of this battle, but the entire future of the American campaign in Mexico. The road to Mexico City lay through Cerro Gordo, and Scott was about to gamble everything on the skill of his soldiers and the audacity of a plan that would either be remembered as brilliant or as the folly that destroyed an army. The pre-dawn darkness of April 18, 1847, provided the perfect cover for one of the most audacious military maneuvers in American military history. Captain Robert Edward Lee, moving with the silent precision of a man whose life depended on remaining undetected, led the advance party along the treacherous path he had discovered during his reconnaissance. Behind him, stretching back into the mountain shadows like a blue serpent, came the lead elements of General David Emanuel Twiggs's division. Nearly 3,000 American soldiers beginning what would become known as one of the war's most decisive flanking movements. The path that Lee had identified was everything he had described and worse. In places it was barely 18 inches wide, clinging to cliff faces that dropped hundreds of feet into rocky gorges below. Soldiers had to remove their packs and pass them separately, while officers dismounted and led their horses by hand through sections where a single misstep would mean certain death. The route twisted and turned through terrain that seemed designed by nature to prevent any military movement. Yet somehow, Lee had found a way to thread the needle of the Mexican defenses. Brigadier General Twiggs, despite his 60 years and the arthritis that plagued his joints, insisted on personally leading his men along the hazardous route. His presence served as both inspiration and practical necessity. The soldiers needed to see their commander sharing the same risks, the same discomforts, and the same determination that the mission demanded. Every few hundred yards, Twiggs would pause to check on his men, ensuring that the column remained intact and that no one had been lost to the treacherous terrain. Meanwhile, at the main American position, General Scott orchestrated an elaborate deception designed to fix Santa Anna's attention on the obvious approaches. Artillery batteries opened a steady bombardment of the Mexican positions, while infantry units conducted conspicuous movements that suggested preparation for a frontal assault. The sound of cannon fire echoed through the mountain passes, masking the noise of Twiggs's flanking movement and reinforcing Santa Anna's belief that the Americans would attempt the very attack he had prepared to repel. The Mexican commander, confident in his defensive preparations, watched the American artillery barrage with satisfaction. From his command post atop Cerro Gordo, Santa Anna could see the puffs of white smoke that marked each American cannon shot, and he smiled grimly as his own artillery responded with devastating effect. The narrow defile was becoming a killing ground exactly as he had planned, and he began to envision the moment when the American infantry would advance into his carefully prepared crossfire. But Santa Anna's attention remained fixed on the drama, unfolding directly in front of him, and he failed to notice the subtle signs that might have warned him of the approaching disaster. Mexican scouts assigned to patrol the seemingly impassable terrain on the left flank had grown complacent, convinced that no substantial force could possibly navigate the rocky wilderness that protected that approach. The few reports of unusual activity in the mountains were dismissed as sightings of local civilians or perhaps small American scouting parties of no consequence. As the morning progressed, Twiggs's division continued its grueling advance through terrain that challenged every assumption about what was militarily possible. Officers passed along whispered orders, sergeants maintained iron discipline, and individual soldiers drew upon reserves of endurance they had never known they possessed. The column moved with the deliberate patience of men who understood that speed was less important than stealth. That discovery would mean not just failure but annihilation. By midday, the lead elements of the American flanking force had reached positions that Lee had marked during his reconnaissance, rocky outcroppings that provided concealment while offering clear fields of fire toward the rear of the Mexican defensive positions. The trap was nearly set, and Santa Anna remained completely unaware that his impregnable fortress was about to be attacked from the one direction he had never seriously considered. The next phase of the battle would determine whether Lee's audacious reconnaissance and Twiggs's dangerous march would culminate in victory or disaster. The sun reached its zenith over the Sierra Madre Oriental as the first American soldiers emerged from the mountain wilderness onto the heights that Santa Anna had believed to be impregnable. Captain Robert Edward Lee, his uniform torn and stained from the grueling march, raised his field glasses to survey the Mexican position spread out below him. What he saw confirmed his most optimistic projections. The enemy's rear guard was minimal, their attention completely focused on the threat they perceived from the main road, and their artillery was positioned to repel an attack from precisely the opposite direction. General David Emanuel Twiggs, breathing heavily from the exertion of the climb, but with his eyes bright with the anticipation of battle, moved quickly to deploy his division. The 1st Regiment of Infantry, commanded by Colonel William Selby Harney, took position on the left of the line. The 2nd Regiment of Artillery, fighting as infantry under Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Benton Barrage, occupied the center. The 3rd Regiment of Infantry, led by Colonel James Silas McIntosh, formed the right wing of the attacking force. The moment had arrived for one of the most challenging tactical maneuvers in military history, the coordination of a flanking attack, with a frontal assault across difficult terrain against a numerically superior enemy. Twiggs' men had to strike with perfect timing, neither too early nor too late, while General Scott's main force launched its own attack from the opposite direction. The margin for error was virtually non-existent. At precisely 2 o'clock in the Idri afternoon, the distinctive sound of an American bugle call echoed across the mountains, the signal that both forces had been waiting for. Twiggs raised his sword, the blade catching the afternoon sunlight, and his voice carried across the rocky slopes with the authority of a man who had spent his lifetime preparing for this moment. Forward, men, for the honor of the flag and the glory of the Republic! The American soldiers surged forward with a roar that seemed to shake the mountains themselves. The 1st Infantry Regiment, composed largely of Irish immigrants and German volunteers who had found their new home in the expanding American Army, advanced with the disciplined precision of professional soldiers. Their bayonets glinted in the afternoon sun as they moved across the rocky terrain, each man knowing that the success of the entire campaign might depend on the next few minutes. The Mexican defenders, caught completely by surprise, struggled to respond to an attack from a direction they had never seriously considered. Santa Anna's carefully planned defensive positions, so perfectly oriented to repel an assault from the main road, were suddenly facing the wrong way. Artillery pieces that had been positioned to create devastating crossfires found themselves unable to traverse far enough to engage the American flanking force. Colonel José María Tornel, Santa Anna's most trusted subordinate, was among the first Mexican officers to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around them. Racing. From position to position, he attempted to rally the surprised defenders and organize some form of coherent response to the unexpected attack. But the Americans had achieved complete tactical surprise, and the Mexican response was fragmented and confused. The sound of rifle fire began to crackle across the mountainside as American soldiers engaged Mexican defenders at close range. The macabre, superior training and equipment of the American regular army began to tell, as disciplined volleys from Springfield muskets found their targets among the Mexican ranks. The 2nd Artillery Regiment, despite fighting outside their normal role, maintained the steady rate of fire that had made American artillery respected throughout the war. As the flanking attack developed, General Scott's main force launched its coordinated assault from the opposite direction. The combined pressure from two directions created chaos in the Mexican defensive positions, as units found themselves taking fire from multiple angles and struggling to maintain any coherent formation. The carefully constructed fortress that Santa Anna had believed to be impregnable was beginning to crumble under the weight of American tactical innovation and superior execution. The battle had reached its critical moment, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of the armies engaged, but the future of the entire Mexican-American War. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the battlefield as the Mexican defensive positions began to disintegrate under the relentless pressure of the American two-pronged assault. General Antonio López de Santa Anna, his face a mask of disbelief and growing desperation, watched from his command post as the supposedly impregnable fortress of Cerro Gordo transformed into a scene of chaos and confusion. The methodical defensive plan that had seemed so perfect in conception was crumbling with devastating speed. Colonel José María Tornel, attempting to rally the 3rd Mexican Infantry Regiment, found himself shouting orders that could barely be heard above the din of battle. The Mexican soldiers, many of whom were conscripts with minimal training and equipment, were struggling to understand how their enemies had appeared in their rear when all their preparations had been focused on the frontal approaches. The psychological impact of being attacked from an unexpected direction was as devastating as the physical damage inflicted by American rifle fire. "Retreat to the secondary positions," Tornel commanded, his voice hoarse from shouting over the sound of gunfire. "Form new lines on the reverse slope." But the carefully planned secondary positions that existed on paper had never been properly prepared, and the Mexican units found themselves falling back into terrain that offered little cover and no coordinated fields of fire. The American advance continued with relentless momentum. Colonel William Selby Harney's 1st Infantry Regiment had swept around the left flank of the Mexican position, capturing artillery pieces that had been positioned to command the main road, but were now useless against an attack from the rear. The American soldiers, many of whom had never experienced combat before the Mexican-American War, were fighting with the confidence of men who sensed that victory was within their grasp. Captain Robert Edward Lee, his engineer's eye still focused on the tactical situation, had positioned himself where he could observe the entire battlefield. The flanking maneuver that had begun with his reconnaissance was succeeding beyond his most optimistic projections. The Mexican defensive positions were collapsing in sequence, like a line of dominoes falling in predetermined order. The Mexican artillery, which had been expected to provide the decisive advantage in the battle, found itself in an impossible situation. The cannon that had been so carefully positioned to create interlocking fields of fire along the main road could not be turned quickly enough to engage the American flanking force. Artillery crews, trained to work as teams in the precise choreography of loading and firing, were being picked off by American riflemen who had infiltrated to within a few hundred yards of the gun positions. General Scott's main force, attacking from the opposite direction, was encountering less resistance than anticipated. The Mexican troops defending the frontal approaches had been weakened as Santa Anna attempted to shift units to counter the flanking attack. The result was that neither position was adequately defended, and the American forces were able to maintain pressure on both fronts simultaneously. The 2nd Mexican Cavalry Regiment, which had been held in reserve to exploit any breakthrough opportunities, found itself committed to a desperate defensive action for which it was poorly suited. Cavalry charges up steep rocky slopes against entrenched infantry positions were exercises in futility, but Santa Anna had no other reserves available to throw into the battle. According to contemporary battlefield reports preserved in the Washington National Intelligencer, the collapse of the Mexican position at Cerro Gordo occurred with stunning rapidity once the flanking attack achieved its initial objectives. The Mexican army, which had numbered over 12,000 men at the beginning of the battle, was disintegrating as individual units found themselves cut off from their commanders and unable to coordinate any effective resistance. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Mexican retreat had become a rout. Soldiers were abandoning their positions and fleeing toward the interior of Mexico, carrying with them tales of American tactical brilliance and Mexican tactical confusion. The road to Mexico City, which had been blocked by what appeared to be an impregnable mountain fortress, was now open to American advance. Santa Anna himself, recognizing that the battle was lost beyond any possibility of recovery, was preparing to abandon his command post and join the general retreat. The Mexican commander, who had once declared that he would make the Americans pay dearly for every mile of Mexican soil, was about to discover that some battles are lost before they are fought. The setting sun of April 18, 1847, painted the blood-soaked heights of Cerro Gordo in shades of gold and crimson as General Winfield Scott surveyed the complete collapse of Mexican resistance. The battlefield, which had witnessed one of the most decisive victories in American military history, was now strewn with the evidence of Santa Anna's catastrophic defeat: abandoned artillery pieces, scattered equipment, and the bodies of Mexican soldiers who had paid the ultimate price for their commander's strategic miscalculation. The statistics of the American victory were staggering by any measure. The Mexican army had lost over 3,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, including 43 officers and nearly 3,000 enlisted men who had been taken prisoner. Among the captured were 5 generals, including the prestigious General Guerrero and General La Vega, whose presence in American custody represented a devastating blow to Mexican military prestige. The Americans, by contrast, had suffered fewer than 400 casualties, a remarkable achievement considering the strength of the Mexican positions and the difficulty of the terrain. Captain Robert Edward Lee, now recognized as the architect of the victory through his audacious reconnaissance and tactical planning, stood beside General Scott as they watched the last Mexican defenders disappear into the mountain passes. The young engineer's contribution to the battle would be remembered as one of the finest examples of military intelligence and tactical innovation in American history. His ability to identify the path that made the flanking maneuver possible had transformed what appeared to be an impossible military situation into a triumph of tactical brilliance. "Captain Lee," General Scott observed, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and recognition, "your reconnaissance has opened the road to Mexico City. The enemy's strongest defensive position has been turned into their greatest defeat." The general's words were prophetic, for the Battle of Cerro Gordo had indeed eliminated the last major obstacle between the American army and the Mexican capital. The captured Mexican artillery represented a particularly significant prize. 43 cannons, including some of the finest pieces in the Mexican arsenal, had fallen into American hands. These weapons, many of them manufactured in European foundries and representing the latest in military technology, would be turned against their former owners in the battles to come. The irony was not lost on the American officers who examined the captured equipment. Mexican defensive preparations had been thorough and sophisticated, but they had been based on incorrect assumptions about American tactical capabilities. General Santa Anna's personal effects, abandoned in his hasty retreat, provided additional evidence of the completeness of the Mexican defeat. The general's correspondence, including letters to government officials in Mexico City, revealed the confidence with which he had approached the battle and his complete inability to anticipate the American flanking maneuver. Among the captured documents were detailed defensive plans that showed the sophistication of Mexican preparations and the fatal flaw that had doomed them to failure. the strategic consequences of the victory extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The road to Mexico City now lay open to American advance, and the Mexican government's ability to organize effective resistance had been severely compromised. The cream of the Mexican army had been destroyed or scattered, and the psychological impact of such a decisive defeat would undermine Mexican morale throughout the remainder of the war. For the American soldiers who had participated in the battle, Cerro Gordo represented validation of their training, their equipment, and their tactical doctrine. The victory had been achieved through a combination of superior reconnaissance, innovative tactics, and flawless execution under extremely difficult conditions. The flanking maneuver that had seemed impossible when first proposed had been carried out with the precision of a military exercise, demonstrating the professional competence of the American officer corps and the quality of American soldiers. The Battle of Cerro Gordo had lasted less than 6 hours, but its consequences would shape the remainder of the Mexican-American War. Santa Anna's army, which had been intended to halt American progress and perhaps force a negotiated settlement, had instead been destroyed as an effective fighting force. The road to Mexico City stretched ahead, and with it the prospect of American victory in a war that would reshape the map of North America. As darkness fell over the Sierra Madre Oriental, the American army prepared to continue its advance into the heart of Mexico, carrying with it the momentum of a victory that would be remembered as one of the finest examples of tactical innovation in military history. The mountain fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had become the gateway to conquest, and the young American Republic had demonstrated that it possessed not only the will to expand its territory, but the military skill to make that expansion a reality.